Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. September 29th, 1918. Before dawn had fully lifted, the Western Front was already awake in the way a loaded rifle is awake, silent, tense, and waiting for the first trigger. In a cramped farmhouse headquarters that smelled of damp wool, ink, and stale tobacco, a British general stared at the man across the table as if he'd just heard a joke in the middle of a funeral. Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, Australian, engineer by trade, outsider by pedigree, stood over a map so crowded with pencil lines, timings, and coordinate boxes it looked less like a battlefield and more like a construction site plan. 4 hours, the British general said, voice flat with disbelief. You're telling me you'll break the Hindenburg Line in 4 hours? Monash didn't blink. Yes, sir, 4 hours. The general's expression hardened into the familiar mask of men who'd watched too many attacks dissolve into wire and blood. We've been trying to crack that fortress for years, tens of thousands dead. The French can't do it. We can barely do it. The Americans are new to this nightmare and already paying for every yard. And you're sitting here saying your Australians will do it in a single morning. Monash tapped the map once, twice, as if setting a metronome. Not only break it, he said, calm as a man discussing concrete curing time. We'll be through it and pushing beyond. The objective isn't to win a duel with every machine gun post. The objective is movement, continuous movement. We take what makes the next ground possible. The British officer shook his head and turned away, carrying with him a private certainty that this was just another colonial making impossible promises. Brave words to be paid for by other men's bodies. But Monash wasn't bragging. He was doing arithmetic with lives. The Hindenburg Line was Germany's insurance policy, a defensive system built after years of grinding trench war to be the last unbreakable shield if everything else failed. Multiple trench belts, deep dugouts, concrete bunkers, machine gun nests placed so their fire overlapped like the teeth of a saw, and wire so dense it became a landscape of its own. And stitched into that system was the St Quentin Canal, sometimes open water in a steep cutting, sometimes vanishing into the Bellecourt Tunnel, turning the ground itself into a moat that laughed at tanks and punished infantry. It was the kind of defense that didn't just stop an assault, it punished the idea of trying, and for years it had done exactly that. Some British generals privately believed the line was effectively unbreakable, that the war would end only when Germany's economy and morale collapsed from exhaustion. Monash looked at the same fortress and saw something else. Not a legend, but a system. And systems could be understood, measured, and defeated. That was the difference. He wasn't the kind of commander who planned attacks over brandy and tradition. He planned like an engineer because he was one. Before the war, he'd built bridges and power infrastructure in Melbourne, structures that had to hold under load or people died. Now the load was human. He studied aerial photographs until the details burned into his eyes, interviewed junior officers who'd probed German wire and trench angles, and demanded that artillery, infantry, tanks, and aircraft be treated not as separate heroic stories but as components of one machine. He'd already proven this kind of thinking at Hamel earlier in 1918, where a tightly timed combined arms attack ran almost to the minute, shocking an army used to improvising chaos into a plan after the first wave got slaughtered. Now he scaled that method up to the biggest lock on the door. He built full-scale mock-ups of German trench layouts behind Australian lines, and he made his men rehearse again and again, dozens of times, until movement roots lived in muscle memory, until every soldier knew where he needed to be and when. Not because an officer might be nearby to scream it, but because the plan had been made understandable. And then Monash committed what conservative minds considered a crime. He explained the plan to everyone, not just officers. British doctrine often treated soldiers as smart ammunition. Point them forward, tell them little, burden them with nothing but obedience. Monash believed the opposite. He sat men down and told them, here's what we're doing, here's why, here's your role, and when things go wrong, and they will, use your head and keep the intent alive. The British were horrified by the idea of giving common soldiers the strategic picture, fearing panic or questions. Monash smiled because he was betting on something the old doctrine didn't trust: intelligent initiative. That morning, the war tested that bet with fire. At roughly 5:50 a.m., the darkness didn't fade so much as rupture. Around 1,600 guns opened in a coordinated roar, an artillery effort so massive witnesses miles away thought the earth itself had cracked. The barrage wasn't the old British habit of pounding for days and politely warning the enemy exactly where you plan to die. It was violent, concentrated, and timed to an infantry clock, designed to smash wire, bury trenches, and keep defenders pinned in dugouts while assault troops moved. And then the men went in. Americans in the front sectors assigned to the initial breach, Australians ready to leapfrog and exploit, and British formations to the south tasked with doing the impossible thing, forcing crossings at the canal cutting itself. Almost immediately, the battlefield showed its teeth. Fog clung to the ground and made distances lie. Tanks churned forward, some carrying fascines, huge bundles meant to be dropped into trenches or gaps as instant bridges, industrial beasts hauling medieval solutions. Some tanks broke down, some were knocked out, some bogged in the churned mud because tanks in 1918 were still half weapon, half experiment. In the places where coordination held, it was terrifyingly efficient. German machine gun teams that expected minutes to rise, aim, and scythe down attackers instead found themselves smothered by shell bursts and then hit by infantry before they could even clear the dirt from their mouths. But in other places, especially in the northern sector, the plan met the consequences of earlier fighting and battlefield confusion. A preliminary operation operation on September 27th had gone badly for some American units, leaving parts of the approach tangled, some German positions insufficiently cleared, and the whole assault starting with confusion already in the bloodstream. In the 27th Division's area, the protective creeping barrage that often shielded infantry was missing, and men moved in fog into machine gun fire, units breaking into scattered groups as Germans re-emerged from deep dugouts behind the first wave like ghosts with rifles. The clean timetable began to smear in real time, and what should have been a smooth Australian exploitation became in places a brutal close fight for individual strongpoints, trenches, and dugout mouths. This is where battle stories usually lie, because clean victories sell better than messy ones. But the truth is more interesting. September 29th contained both brilliance and chaos at once, and the difference between the two was often measured in whether soldiers understood the intent well enough to improvise when the script tore. In the Australian sectors where Monash's philosophy had soaked into the ranks, that improv mattered. A squad hit wire that hadn't been cut where the map promised. Instead of piling into a single doomed knot, one section began cutting and marking lanes while another shifted laterally to find a weak seam. A machine gun post held up one group. A neighboring group didn't freeze waiting for orders. It flanked, threw bombs, and moved on because they understood the point wasn't to win a duel with every gun, it was to keep the wave rolling. When tanks failed, infantry didn't stop dead because the plan didn't worship tanks, it used them. And even when the day bogged down in parts of the tunnel sector, the larger system began to crack, because to the south, the impossible crossing succeeded. British 9th Corps, most famously the 46th North Midland Division, forced the canal cutting at Riqueval and Bellenglise, and in a moment where speed was worth more than glory, troops seized the Riqueval Bridge before it could be destroyed, turning a prepared obstacle into a captured doorway. They poured across, taking thousands of prisoners and dozens of guns in numbers so large they sounded like propaganda even to the men doing the counting, and that southern thrust threatened to roll the line sideways. A defense can endure frontal pressure longer than it can endure being turned. Meanwhile, American success in other sectors, particularly where the 30th Division held together, enabled Australian formations to surge through and seize key positions like Bellecourt, ripping open linkages in the German defensive machine. The Hindenburg Line did not disappear politely by lunchtime, and fighting around the canal continued into early October, with brutal, close-quarter battles needed to clear stubborn nodes of resistance. But the myth died on September 29th, and myth was part of the fortification. A line like that is not just concrete and wire, it is belief whispered through an army. If we can get back there, we can hold. When that belief snapped, the entire German strategic posture began to drift. That same day, German war leader Erich Ludendorff, one of the men holding the political and military machine together, told the Kaiser and civilian leadership that the situation was so dangerous he could not guarantee the front's integrity even for hours, and he demanded an immediate move toward an armistice. Within days, the German government began formally seeking terms, and on October 3rd, Germany reached out to President Woodrow Wilson for an armistice framework, a signal that the war's end was no longer a distant theory, but an urgent political act. None of that happened because one side discovered courage for the first time. Courage had been drowning in mud since 1914. It happened because the last confident "we can still hold" had been punctured in a way that could not be quickly patched. And the human cost still mattered, even in successful operations. The Australians paid thousands of casualties in the St Quentin Canal fighting. The British and Americans paid heavily too, and on the German side there were dead, wounded, and a flood of prisoners. Men who surrendered not because they were cowards, but because the system around them was collapsing and discipline was no longer strong enough to hold reality back. Afterward, the reactions in British High Command were as human as they were uncomfortable: pride that the line had been breached, and resentment that it had been done by methods that exposed the waste of earlier doctrine. For years, old leadership had told itself, and its politicians, that enormous casualties were inevitable, that the fortress could only be cracked by sacrifice. Monash's method suggested a different truth, that planning, coordination, and trust in soldiers' intelligence could reduce waste, and that truth is flattering to nobody who built a career on waste. So the rumors came, as they always do when an outsider embarrasses tradition. The Germans were weak there, the Australians got lucky, the sector was softer, fog did it, tanks did it, anything except admitting that a colonial engineer had solved problems their finest minds had been treating like fate. The irony is that the ideas Monash practiced, combined arms, tight fire and movement coordination, rehearsals, and mission-type intent, would become standard study material for modern armies, because armies always learn from what breaks them. But in the moment, in that damp farmhouse before dawn, what mattered wasn't future doctrine or wounded pride. It was the cold, simple fact that Monash's plan treated soldiers as thinking humans. And when the battlefield did what battlefields always do, when fog hid landmarks, when tanks died, when units scattered and unexpected fire opened from the flank, thinking humans could adapt and keep moving. That is what really cracked the Hindenburg Line. Not magic, not bravado, not a fairy tale timetable executed perfectly, but a system of intelligence and preparation strong enough to survive the moment the script tore. September 29th, 1918, didn't just help end World War I, it proved something armies hate learning the hard way: that intelligence beats tradition, that preparation beats romantic bravery, and that trusting soldiers to understand purpose produces better results else than treating them like ammunition. The tragedy is how many had to die before that lesson was accepted, and the warning is how quickly institutions forget it when the guns go quiet.